and welcome to everyone joining us for this AMSA Town Hall session. It's a little bit after 7, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First and foremost, we'd like to give a warm welcome to everybody joining us for tonight's Town Hall session on how to get published. Before we get started, we're going to go over a bit of housekeeping. First, please note that we have placed everyone on mute to help control audio quality. I can unmute as needed, so if you feel the desire, just let me know. Next, we will have time at the end of the session for questions and answers, and there may be some time in between or during the presentation for questions and answers as well. You can submit your questions via the Q&A or the chat box throughout the presentation. Note, you need to click on the chat icon in the top right corner or somewhere on the right-hand side of the WebEx interface in order for those dialog boxes to become visible. Lastly, we are recording today's session so we can make it available on the AMSA website. So if you know somebody that wasn't able to join us or you need to reference it at a later point, feel free to go ahead and share it with them when it's up online. It should be up probably within about a week. Now with the housekeeping out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get back to today's topic, which will focus mainly on how to get published. So the word publish can stir up a number of thoughts. Things like, I want to publish scientific research, or I'm a med student, not an English major, I don't need to practice narrative or overall writing skills. These are some pretty common thoughts, and our speaker, Pete Thomson, who I'll introduce in just a minute, is going to spend some time covering the value that being published, be it in scientific or narrative pieces, can provide to you as an aspiring physician. AMSA has a wide variety of vehicles that you can use to practice and finesse writing skills, and as a member you can also use AMSA outlets to promote an opinion or a perspective that you feel passionate about. So the AMSA motto is that it takes more than med school to make a physician, and publishing opportunities are just another tool you can take advantage of to be the best physician you can be. So let me go ahead and introduce ourselves before I officially hand the presentation over to Pete. So I'm Noreen Rich, and I'll be moderating tonight's presentation. Feel free, like I said before, to use the chat box and the Q&A box to submit questions and thoughts that you have and you'd like us to share. You should also be able to chat amongst yourselves via the chat box. In addition to my moderation skills, I'm also the Director of Membership for AMSA, and I work closely with many of AMSA's national leaders and campus chapter leaders. So don't hesitate to contact me if you have questions about recruitment, chapter management, member benefits, and so on. I can put you in touch with your regional director if you need more firsthand perspective, or I can also put you in touch with some other staff members if I don't know the answer to your question. So feel free to reach out to us. As for tonight's main speaker, Pete Thomson is AMSA's Director of Publications and the editor for AMSA's bi-monthly magazine, which you should all receive and be reading, called The New Physician. Before joining the AMSA staff in 2004, Pete wrote for the Syracuse Post-Standard, Travel Today Egypt. He was also an associate editor for Newswire services at the Federal Document Clearinghouse. Pete holds a master's degree in magazine, newspaper, and online journalism from the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Pete also holds a bachelor's degree in history from Davidson College.
Hello, I'm Pete. So Noreen described a bit of my background, and I will start by saying, and this will be evident throughout our talk this evening, that I come from a magazine background mostly, and that's going to be that'll shape some of the things I say, and a lot of these things you can take or leave. But one of the first things that we need to do, besides talking a little bit about myself, would be a real quick overview of AMSA's publications. And my goal for the talk this evening is not to talk to you about what purely AMSA opportunities, but I will use these publications, our own internal publications, as examples of some of the opportunities that are out there in other areas as well. So if you'll pardon that. So we have the New Position magazine, which is a bi-monthly member publication for our members, and many of you should receive it in either print or electronic editions. The New Position goes out to, these days, around 30, our circulation, I think, is about 32,000, mostly medical students and pre-medical students. We think of it as a modified bi-monthly, so we go back to back in the fall with September and then immediately October issues, and then we have a long summer issue. The Weekly Consult is a weekly e-newsletter that we produce that is sort of brings news, summaries, and highlights from the week in healthcare and medicine and medical education. We hope that it brings you some little tips that you might not have gotten elsewhere to sort of enrich your lives. And AMSA on Call is AMSA's official blog, and it has a wide variety of content, everything from leadership perspective to individual member opinion to tips for medical students, service content, et cetera, is all included there. And so with that out of the way, and again, these will come up as periodic examples and throughout. I'm going to talk about a few different buckets of publications. And of course, you can slice publications in general into 4,000 different categories and, infinitely more than that. Really what we're going to be talking about are types of periodical publications, things that come out routinely, news, et cetera. But if I can divide them into 3 broad buckets for our conversation, I would divide them into sort of formal and scientific journals. I would also add magazine and other sort of long-form journalism, in which I would include the New Position in that category, and blogs and other online formats, which I realize is something of a catch-all category. And also, I think there's the easy argument that is the distinctions between that category and, say, magazine and long-form journalism are relatively gray and probably getting grayer over time. There are, there's certainly some distinctions in those different at the extremes of either of those formats, especially when it comes to formality, procedures in terms of fact-checking and other things, ranging on one end, say, from highly personal blogs, like my dog has a blog, which is now more or less defunct. But for example, my dog's blog versus the New Position magazine are sort of on opposite ends of the black and white spectrum between magazine long-form content and a weblog. So those are sort of the 3 broad buckets that I'll be talking about in terms of opportunities for medical students moving into publishing and sort of interested in that to augment their careers, to build out your CV, et cetera. So let's look at, and I think one of our first, and if I may, let us look at sort of what the first question that we would need to answer is, and I shouldn't say we, but more you have to answer for yourself, or what are your goals out of publication? Certainly, and I think a lot of folks in medical education are looking to enhance their CV, their application. There's certainly the idea in academia and academic medicine and science that, this sort of publish or perish mentality, and they start you out early by basically making it seem imperative that you have publication experience in your application materials. So I'm not your admissions advisor for medical school or residency. However, that is certainly an important distinction. And also you might be looking to build out experience. You're going into a career that you might be looking for an outlet that turns into something that gives you a broader audience. You're going to wind up with emotional experiences that are going to give you things to say, so cathartic expression is going to be important. Certainly in publishing in general, you may have a subject that you're particularly interested in advocating for, et cetera. It could be personal, it could be large, it could be a huge political item. And obviously publishing is a way to get the word out about your topic, to help people identify with your subject matter and engage people in that regard. So these are all sort of, and these goals are all about what's important to you. There are a lot of arguments you can make in terms of what's important, for example, on a CV. Certainly, I think in a lot of people's minds, they're strictly looking for scientific or peer-reviewed publication to be seen there. I would argue that there's a lot of value in having experience listed on your CV that is narrative, long-form journalism, other types of publication, I think are also highly valuable, especially as we move in the big name scientific publications you see all the time. There's become this expectation that major studies are going to be surrounded by this non-dry commentary. They're going to have commentary that surrounds them that help humanize these big, vast scientific studies. And that's the kind of thing that you can build experience in through long-form journalism and other sort of long-form writing for publication. And all those things have value. So I don't want to put any of these different motivations on top of one another. They're all completely valid. One note is that you may find that when I talk about publication and publishing and writing even, although for me on a personal level, what's important is often cathartic expression, just sort of a creative outlet. Realistically, over time, I learned to think of it as from more of a mercenary perspective in terms of it being trying to keep the reader in mind and really sort of push their agenda. So we'll talk a little bit about that kind of perspective. So the important thing is to think about what your goals are, because our next step is sort of getting into actually what is the mechanism by which you are going to get published. I'm going to focus largely on non-peer-reviewed publications, non-formal publications, because a lot of the journals and whatnot, you're going to be finding a research team. You're going to be going through a very strict submissions process that will be dependent on that individual publication, et cetera. And a lot of that's going to be outlined for you. So in those terms, what's going to be important is more about the science and the research before you get to that publication point. These are all mechanisms that you could independently pursue to put your name in print. And I use the term print loosely. Certainly, there's a lot of value in modern electronic publications and whatnot, and those are all great outlets. So, but to publish. So, walking through the process of how we're going to do this. Here's my quick overview. So basically, we're going to start. You're going to find a topic, and then we'll discuss the particulars of that in a moment. And actually, what I'm going to do is hedge on that. You're going to find the right home for it. So you're looking for a publication that really fits with your topic or fits with you, and that you can make a good pitch. You're going to analyze that publication. You're going to take a look at what it is that they're looking for in their audience, and we'll describe some of the particulars in that area as well. And then you're going to put together a pitch. And I'm going to fork that into two different mechanisms. One being a query process, which is relatively common in sort of long-form publications, magazines in particular. The other mechanism being manuscript submission, which is also pretty common, certainly common with the New Physician and other publications, and may be the right fit for you. However, I'm going to put them together because even though they're different processes, they share a lot of the same. There's a lot of the same thing you're doing. You're still pitching. You're still trying to sell your idea, and you're still doing all the analysis of the publication, and you're still trying to pick the right publication, and it still starts with what the topic is. So let's walk through these a little bit. So I'm going to basically skip the topic selection part because that's going to be something that's really about you. You really want to find something that you are already sold on, something that interests you for whatever reason. Like I mentioned before, if your goal in publishing is about advocacy for a particular subject, you know, you're looking for something that's either dear to your heart, something that deeply offends you, something that's going to keep you attached to it, because you're going to be doing a lot of work on this, and you need to be able to stay focused and have some emotional connection to it, regardless of what it is. You don't want, at this phase, you're assigning yourself something to work on. So you don't want to assign yourself something that is really not compelling to you, because that will be the worst. And also the end result, it'll show. You know, that not only, so even if you can persevere through a topic like that, it's going to show in the end product. Emotional attachment to the subject is critical. Next, what you're going to do is you're going to find the right spot for this to go. And these days, this is both an easy thing to do, but also in some ways it's more difficult because there are so many different options out there for you. You know, 10 years ago, we would say, go get a copy of Writers Weekly or whatever publication, Writers Monthly, I forget. And it was basically this book that listed all the magazines and all of the outlets. And certainly you can find that online times 100. So you might want to start with publications you're familiar with, ones you understand, one that you read yourself, and don't be afraid to reach. I mentioned on my slide here aspirational publications. You know, there's no reason not to pitch a story to a big name publication. And we're going to talk a little bit about different areas within any given publication. But just because, you know, don't be intimidated by the name brand. It can be a strategy. You know, you might put a different version of the topic out to a few different places over time, and you might get a hit on something really great, and you really walk away with something you're proud of. At the same time, don't neglect the smaller publications, the ones that have very focused audiences, because there's a lot of value there, and you can get some value out of those, out of working with a publication like that you wouldn't get with a big name. Most notably, for example, and this isn't always true, but you could get more attention paid to you by an editor. So they may work with you for longer. They may show you how they would like to shape the piece, and you kind of work in this collaborative process where you learn a lot about the kind of work that they are doing, and really work with them to get your piece on track and really dial it in. At the same time, their time may be tight as well, so it can vary. So kind of moving forward from there, and this is one reason why, here's some of my tips for researching the publication beforehand, because one of the real great ways to not have a query accepted or et cetera, which basically amounts to an editor sort of just writing no on your email and passing it on, is if you demonstrate an extreme lack of familiarity with the publication. Certainly, for example, with the new position, we'll get a fair amount of submissions which will be, for example, a very specific research paper on an illness or a anatomical structure or something peer-reviewed, not obviously not peer-reviewed, but intended for peer review, formal publication thing. And that's not, we don't do that. Like, that's not something that we include, and it's not, our audience isn't interested in that, at least in reading about it from other students. So that's a non-starter for us. And it also, and beyond it being a non-starter, it also demonstrates that no homework was actually done in selecting us as an outlet. So the steps you're going to take to really sort of look at a publication. This is one reason why I suggest taking a hard look at publications you already are familiar with, because this analysis will be a little bit easier. But what you're going to look at is really think about who their audiences are, who is reading this publication, and you have to think about why those folks are reading this publication. And to sort of walk it through, let's say, the new physician, and for me to try to look at it from a reader perspective or a writer who's pitching something. Obviously, the new physician's audience, primarily medical students. We have some dedicated pre-medical content, and we have some what we'd like to think of as medical student content that is aspirationally important to pre-medical students. So that's our audience. And you can also sort of add who is not our audience. Our audience does not intentionally include practicing physicians. Now, would some of the content in the magazine have interest for them? Yes, it probably would have some interest. That wasn't the goal. So if you are someone reaching out and looking to speak to practicing physicians, you might not want to pitch your article to us, or if you are going to, you may want to adapt it to our audience. So you need to understand who their audience is and why they read that publication. Think about how the magazine is fitting into those folks' lives. Is it something that is intended for these long-form weekend reads, very long features, very in-depth? How dense is it? Or is it light? Is it small bits of information that the readers can digest easily? So you need to sort of understand how the magazine is approaching its audience. There's some other elements. What's the tone and style? And that's part of how they reach those folks too. Is it lighthearted? Is it funny? Is it kind of satirical? You know, is it very serious? Does it take itself seriously? I would add into that, and this is one element that really sort of defines, in my mind, magazine and work more so than other, say, more serious publications. Well, magazines are very serious. I don't mean to say they're not serious. More formal publications don't do this. But one thing the magazines do that sets them apart is we allow a certain amount of authors' voice, and we allow the author's knowledge to come through. And those are things you're going to want to look for in these publications, because different publications will allow different amounts of that. And what I mean is, for example, if we have a department in the magazine that is what we would call a service department, or a sort of a how-to advice department for, say, pre-medical students on preparing, let's just say preparing for MCAT 2015. And let's say we're having it written by a first-year medical student, so someone who has just been accepted to medical school and started. So they can relate. And because that author is valuable to the piece, we're going to let that author include a little bit of their own story in this advice column to make it approachable to the reader. And it makes it a little bit more interesting, and it invites them in a little bit, as opposed to just having dry bullets on a topic, et cetera. So that's an example of how we might allow a little bit of the author's voice to come in. Like maybe they start with an anecdote or otherwise. In terms of author knowledge, for example, we might allow the author to bring facts that are common or would be understood by them to the piece without attributing it to anyone other than themselves. The opposite of this would be in a formal publication where you cite, let's say in the beginning of your research paper, you cite the circumference of the Earth, or no, let's say the population, the general population of the world, and you say it's 6 billion. And then you have to put a footnote as to where you found that information. Now, we might say in the magazine that that is a generally well-known enough fact that we do not actually need to attribute that to anyone, so we're going to let you say that, and we're going to move on. And that's about sort of how much knowledge they let their authors bring to the piece. And certainly in say, a column or some of the advice columns, you would see it where the author is the only voice speaking, and they're the ones providing the advice without it being attributed to anyone else. Preferably, you know, certainly with the new position, we try not to do that, and we like to bring in other sources, et cetera, for any piece. However, we would allow, for example, a medical student or a writer to bring some of their knowledge and their own experience to the article. So, and part of that too is you want to look at who's writing for them. Are they using a lot of freelancers? Are they using people who are from among their readership? You know, people that seem like their readers. Like if you are reading a magazine about running, you know, are the writers all amateur writers who run a lot and thus can identify with the subject matter and with the readers and kind of really approach it from there. So, like for example, with the new position, we use a mix of freelance writers, and we use you know, medical student and pre-medical student contributors, also some physicians, and we do some staff writing. So, and all of those different types of folks are contributing all kinds of different things in our magazine. That's not always the case. In some magazines, they may always have certain departments written by members, and they'll have another section that's always by freelance professional writers. You know, so you kind of do a little bit of analysis to sort of see what opportunities are there. And lastly, you should also, this can be tough, although these days with you know, search engines it's a lot easier. You can try to get a feel for how recently they've covered your topic. And I wouldn't say that if they've covered it recently that you should rule it out. You certainly need to address that. In our next phase, actually, I think I have another, oh yes, we have one more, a little bit more to talk about with researching it. While you're sort of reading through the publication, and I would personally, as a magazine person, I suggest doing this with any publication you're doing, you're consuming, is looking at the structure of the publication itself. They usually use a fairly routine structure. It may be a little bit hidden from you, but it's there. You know, for example, with a magazine, you're going to have some front matter. What a lot of times we would sort of include like a front of the book section, which is going to be, and this is a little bit cliche, but it's certainly digestible items for us. For the new position, it's our H&P section. It's news items and short little bits, charts, etc. And that's sort of considered like a relatively lightweight entry point for folks. And then as you proceed, for example, through the new position, you're going to encounter service departments, so those how-to and advice pieces, and then eventually you're getting into our feature well, where we're going to have generally two longer form features, journalistic in nature generally, and then after that, we're going to start wrapping it up with some opinion pieces, a review section, which we would consider to be sort of first-person opinion. We have one clinical item, which is very popular, and then we're going to close it out with our back of the book section, which is a lightweight, humorous research items piece. And so that's sort of, from a magazine perspective, especially thinking of it in terms of the physical print item, those cover all of our entry points. We have people who are going in through the middle. We have folks who open the back cover first to sort of see the lightweight entry point there. Anyway, do an analysis of what those different sections are, because the important thing, and this is sort of the important point of doing that analysis, is you need to have an understanding of what their goal for any of those sections is, because you're going to use that in your pitch. And the other thing is you need to look beyond, you need to get out of the mindset, not to imply you're in this mindset, but you need to get beyond the mindset of that the only thing you're aiming for is a feature. That's usually, that's not a great strategy, because this totally depends on the publications, but generally speaking, the features are the biggest investment of time and effort that are going into the publication. And if it's your first time out of the gate, especially with a new publication, and you haven't written in this style before, it might be a tough sell. What would be easier is to look at sort of a department length item. It's often said those kind of unusual front of the book sections, which are usually very flexible, have a lot of opportunity there, which may not be very obvious, but one of the things that I think most people have figured out over time is that writing short items is frankly a lot of times much harder than writing anything long. And so that can be difficult to execute, but it can sometimes be an easy pitch because they may be willing to you know, take a look at something, or you could draft something without them committing to it, and you can get into those front of the book sections, and then you've gotten a clip out of it. You have something to show the next person, or you've developed a relationship with that publication that says, hey, I can do this, I can adhere to deadlines, etc. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to sell the story to the publication, and I don't mean that in the monetary sense necessarily. In fact, that's a risky proposition right out of the gate. But so much as we're going to pitch it to them. And in a querying process, what you're going to be looking for is mostly you have to, okay, so first of all, you're going to sell them on the topic. And that's, you're going to present it to them in some sort of compelling way. And you know, why, and this is where you're going to focus in on who their audience is. Why is that topic important to their audience specifically? Then you have to sell yourself, which is to say, why am I, third-year medical student, the right person to cover this? And that's your opportunity to overcome potential weaknesses they may see. For example, you know, the editor might say, well, you know, I'd really like this to be covered by a 65-year-old physician, you know, but you can talk about the fresh perspective you're going to bring to it and how it affects your generation differently, et cetera. You know, what makes you the right person? Certainly if you have previous experience in writing, this is where you mention that. And what you're demonstrating with that is that you understand the concept of deadlines, that you, et cetera, that you know, can produce a solid effort out of the gate. So one of the other things that's very important to you to include, and you would have to have thought this out beforehand, is you have to sort of think about how you're going to actually do this thing. You have your topic, and you then have to think about what's your strategy. Are you, if for example, you're not an expert in it, you know, who are you going to talk to? Are you going to add sourcing? And for most publications, that would be imperative. You would have to do that. Are you going to talk to, and we're not talking about what documents you're going to look up, although certainly those may help you substantiate your story. You're going to say, I'm going to talk to Dr. So-and-so, who is the dean of this at whatchamacallit school, or I'm going to, I have a classmate who this thing happened to, who I will talk to and interview her for this. And so, especially if one of those sources you're going to bring to it is particularly compelling in some way, and your access to it is unique. For example, the dean is, I don't know, we run together on Wednesday mornings, you know, and et cetera. So only I can get this interview, you know, and really substantiate this piece better than anyone else. You need to include that in your pitch. And yeah, and there you go. And then from there, the good thing about doing a querying process where you're sort of talking about the topic and your strategy is you have already thought everything out. But if the publication wants to make any sort of tweaks to your idea, you haven't already invested the effort in building anything out, and you will not have been as tied to the final product as you would be if you were doing a manuscript, like basically building the entire thing before sending it in. Okay, I'm going to take a quick, I'm going to pause briefly, and then does anyone, just to see if anyone has any questions before I barrel onward.
Sure. There's a few in the Q&A dialog box, Pete. What I'll refer to is, how would you recommend becoming more familiar or finding smaller focused publications that may include a specific topic of interest?
Okay. So I would spend, I'm trying to think of a good example. So certainly I would get a little bit creative with where you're looking. Obviously, you would start probably with a basic search. However, if it were, say, something related to a particular specialty, say, certainly look at whatever associations and societies are involved, because while a lot of them will have, of course, formal journals and publications, they likely also have some other member benefit publication or magazine. There may be, certainly in some specialties, some third-party publications that would also pertain, and a lot of that's going to be time on the search engine. The other thing as well is certainly to ask people that you talk to. For example, if you were to sort of go a little bit down the pathway of doing research on the topic, you can find out what specific industry publications might be read by those folks. There's a lot of really small, unusual, very specifically focused publications out there, a lot of them online only, that if you're not in that scene, they are really hard to access in terms of even finding out about them. So of course, at the same time, if they're too well hidden, then who cares? They have to be out there at least a little bit. So looking in that scene, I would, if you're really serious about doing something more akin to freelance journalism, which is that's a tough thing. But if that is something you really are serious about, there are some actual publications like Writers, is it Writers Weekly? I can't think. They have an online database, for example, where the magazines and other publications are listed, and they maintain their listing. Like the New Position has a listing in there that sort of like send your queries and manuscripts to this email address, attention so-and-so. So it kind of gives you that stuff straightforward, and it's divided out by subject area. So that's a little more serious. Also, frankly, I think you could probably go to your library and find a copy of a publication like Writers Weekly, and take it from there if you want to get real serious about it. Again, I would probably start with publications you consume yourself, and then if you rule those out in terms of outlets for your work, then try to drill down a little bit in the specific subject.
Okay. There is another question, but I think that this one's probably going to be related more toward, I think once you wrap up kind of your process, I'll go back to this one. So if you want to go ahead and move on with the presentation, and I'll loop back with you, that'd be great.
That's good. So after acceptance. So after, and I put acceptance in quotes here because I recognize and have come to recognize that that term has a lot of weight and meaning, especially in the formal publication scene, in which they have a very specific process in which they go through. And it depends, obviously, on each publication, but there are defined stages of where an article sits with them. And at the New Position, we have tried in our sort of ongoing revisions of our submissions process to have some areas that mimic that process, simply because we get a lot of questions about where people's items sit. So that's why I have acceptance in quotes. And you'll also notice that I'm skipping the writing part, which is a fundamental element of putting together an article, is actually writing it. That's really sort of a talk all of its own, and there are a lot of different strategies, and I love to talk about that. But I'm going to hold off and go directly into, once you have your draft into your editors, whatnot. We'll talk a little bit about what the expectations are once you get to that point. And one of the things that's pretty common is sort of this hurry up and wait approach. A lot of publications, and the new physician is an example, although this is not uncommon, because they have at some point a physical production process that goes on. They are working fairly far in advance, and the end result is, and you as an author submitting a piece are on the absolute front of that, like you're at the very beginning, and your submissions process is. And so you're submitting something, and they're like, oh, this is great, and we're really excited. We're going to publish this in a year and a half. And you're like, okay, that's kind of anticlimactic. And so you're sort of out there in limbo, and you're waiting, and then a year and a half later, all of a sudden it's a big, huge rush again because, someone got around to it, and they're working with it, and things have changed, and there's someone new there, et cetera. So, there's a hurry up and wait mentality that goes on. This is common. It happens certainly with us, and it happens elsewhere. And once you kind of get underway in the process, there are basically 4 things that the editing process is trying to do. And I've listed them here on my slide, basically in reverse order. The first being, they're really trying to get clarity out of your document. When you've written a piece, you're very familiar with the subject matter by the time you're typing it up. And the reader coming into it cold may not necessarily have an understanding. And this is a huge, huge thing, because that's the first step in the editor's job, is to try to come at it from a cold perspective and really work with you, hopefully, to clarify what it is you're talking about, to put it simply. One of the difficulties the editors run into over time is that as they become familiar with the piece, they fall into the same trap, which is basically they start to learn the assumptions to make, and they begin to understand it. But that they have to overcome that. So obviously, each individual publication has technical matters of style that they're going to apply. And then fit and finish kind of comes to layout. It's about dialing in every last little bit. One of the hallmarks of a publication that's going to be more along the lines of a magazine or formal publication is that it goes through relatively strict copy editing, et cetera. It's going to be clean and consistent, and that's part of the editing process as well. And after a while, you will not really be involved necessarily in that. It kind of depends a little bit on the publication as to how long they keep you in the loop. So here are some of the things that you as an author would expect to get back for an editing process, and that is going to be, you probably get clarifying questions, which is as I described, when they're looking for clarity of content, they're going to ask you a lot of things. They may ask you to rebuild some part of it, et cetera. You might get track changes depending on the style. I personally do not try not to give authors track changes back. And for example, my thinking with that is I want an author who's reading a draft that I've edited, I want them to read it clean. I don't want them to it's too easy with the track changes to get caught up in what the exact changes were, to jump from modification to modification and try to fiddle out why, and et cetera. I want them to read the whole thing again fresh, straight through, because the changes will make more sense, and also they're more likely to detect other problems on their own as well that we can work together to fix. What you will unlikely that you would see would be sort of final say on edits. A lot of times you can argue something. Certainly I've gotten to a point where an author will come back and say, you took this out, it was really important to me, here's why. And we might work it back in, usually with, well, let's find something else to cut. Or we might have a discussion about it or talk through why, certainly it's a common problem in terms of you know, the author has written something and is becoming very attached to a particular narrative because it has some cathartic element for them, which is completely understandable and is important to the passion I talked about a little while ago. But the reader, it may not translate for the reader. It may be an issue of fit, and then it's like we need to get past this anecdote and move on to the substance of the article in our finite space we have. And so those are some of the discussions that would take place from that point. And yeah, in an ideal world, you'd go back and forth a few times and hopefully are working with a publication in which you would have the opportunity to learn a fair amount of how they're doing it and what their strategy is. I would go into it personally, if you can, with an open mind and the expectation that your piece may come out a little bit different. And I'll tell you, it will also be pretty exciting when it's sort of laid out and you get, you know, the PDF back, or you see the thing in the mail, and it's exciting, and might make it pretty worth it. So anyway, that's sort of something of the process. I think another couple questions in there. So yeah.
Sure. All right, so did you want me to dive into these other ones? I didn't know if you had more slides.
Yeah, I think this is the end of my slides.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well then, so I'm going to dive into these. We've gotten a couple additional questions. They seem to kind of revolve around confidence and professionalism. So okay. I'm going to start with, okay, what would you recommend for someone who has really only written scientific reports when it comes to getting more practice with narrative writing?
Sure, that's a really good question, and certainly something that we encounter a lot at the new position specifically, I think, because of the nature of our readers who transition into being authors for us. First of all, I think that the most important thing is don't worry about that much. Don't get caught up in questions of confidence. You have a lot more freedom with that, moving away from that formal sort of scientific reports and whatnot. You have a lot of freedom, and I would argue that it is, well, you could argue that it is equally difficult to go the other way. So don't get caught up in that. One, I would write a lot. I mean, these pieces of advice are pretty generic, but they're true. I would write often, even if it's just for yourself, and you know, experiment with different styles in terms of incorporating yourself a little bit more. One thing I wouldn't get caught up in is worrying about voice. That will develop organically, in my opinion, over time, and don't force anything. So I would try those things out. If in doubt, start from that scientific report standpoint. There are a lot of pieces that I have worked with in the new position I think have turned out to be very strong pieces in the end, that started out as strong but fairly formal scientific kind of report type articles. And you know, it's very common for us to get something in that's very strictly put together, and it has footnotes, which we don't do. And so we walk through how to unwind those footnotes, turn them into magazine style attribution, what things can the author say in our magazine without having to attribute it. We'll work that stuff in, and then we'll take a look at the piece and say, you know, a lot of times my questions start with, why, okay, so you wrote this article about this specific case. Why was it important to you? Like, what made you write about this topic? And they say, well, you know, the patient, you know, said this, I had this conversation with them, and it was, you know, it was kind of touching because I had this relative, blah, blah. You know, and it has some personal import that wasn't evident in there, and I will help you work that in, for example, and then voila, we have something a little bit closer to this narrative form. So don't sweat it too much, I think is the short article. And practice and read, especially things of the style that you're trying to execute. I'm not saying copying format, but just be aware of the different styles and techniques. look at articles you're reading and think about the structures they use, because the structures are not wildly dissimilar from other scientific reports. It's just that some of those structures are a little bit more hidden. They may have softer leads, we call them, basically the introduction, et cetera. So, so sort of look at how those, other examples.
Okay, great. Another one kind of related, I guess, to maybe the narrative writing is this question's about blogging specifically.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find the right blog platform for you?
I know that it's particularly important with sort of this audience, which is, or rather sort of with among medical students and medical trainees in general. And, it's tough. You have to decide for yourself a little bit. Some of that's going to come out in that research process when you're looking at different, if you're looking at online publications and you're thinking about submitting to someone, you have to think about whether it's the right fit for you. Is it, if you're going to hand them your piece and they're not going to modify it much, it's going to run kind of unaltered, what's the other content that's going to run around it that might sort of, cast aspersions, or is it going to make you seem, even if your piece has nothing in it that's particularly unprofessional, is it going to, is the surrounding content going to be problematic? It's going to, cast a false light on you. So that's something you have to consider in your research on it. Certainly there's a tendency in the editing process to want to, I don't totally want to describe it as pushing the envelope, but one of the things that authors, especially newer authors, will do often is they'll add in a lot, they'll hedge on a lot of things. There's a lot of I think, a lot of passive voice and stuff. And then part of the editing process is to twist some of that out so that the piece makes a statement. As your piece goes through that process, it may wind up making a bolder statement than you intended. That is a little bit the nature of things. Also, if you started with a premise that you support and, if the statement you started with is true to you, then that shouldn't really be a huge problem. I mean, part of the nature of publishing is putting yourself out there. And that is going to entail some risks. A lot of the benefits that come with it will outweigh those risks.
Okay. So we got just a couple more minutes left. I've got one question I think relates directly back to the interview process. So this will probably be the last one, but it is, how would you recommend that someone describe their published work or the experience of getting published in an interview, like for medical school?
Good question. If you were having an interview about it and there were, in terms of a particular question that came up about it, I mean, I guess this is kind of a personal question. I would start with, in many ways that question I think is easier to answer for these narrative form pieces, because you can really use that as an entree to, and again, I'm not an admissions counselor, you can use that as an entree to really talk about why something was important or how it had a particular impact on you. So you can also talk through that about how you, because even with the pieces that I'm describing, especially something where which you did executed interviews and whatnot, there's all kinds of stuff you could tie that into. There's responsibility. You had to adhere to some type of editorial schedule and deadline structure that shows professionalism on your part. There is, especially now as we move, at least in theory, to more of the humanities in the admissions process, you can talk about how you explored the narrative and built that out to address the topic. So there's, it seems like there's a lot of opportunities to sort of take that question and run with it, I would think, in that interview process. I think one of the challenges that we've run into a lot are people asking about us, about what the status of something is, because they're including it in an application and they want to address, is this something that's pending? Is it going to come out, et cetera? And those can be tough to handle, but certainly, you know, it's an exciting accomplishment, especially if you've gotten all the way through it, that you should be able to share with an interviewer.
Okay, great. So I think that pretty much pushes us to our 8 o'clock time, which is our full hour, so I don't see any more questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up, Pete, unless you have anything else you wanted to add.
No, I'm good, but thank you. I appreciate you did an excellent hosting.
Thank you. So, okay, so that's going to be it. So, as we mentioned before, please don't hesitate to contact me or Pete, especially if you have any questions about the writing or the process. We tried to cover a lot of ground, and sometimes, you know, you may still have some questions that occur to you later, so don't hesitate to contact us. So with that, I'm going to conclude our town hall session, and we'd just like to thank you all for joining us. So thank you, and have a good evening.